The herd stopped at the bottom of the loafing pen at 4:40 in the morning. All 40 of them at once, heads up and bodies turned the same direction. And Wade Coulter stood in the open barn door, with a bucket of mineral in one hand, and understood that something had told them to stop. Cattle did not do that. Cattle drifted. They peeled off in ones and twos, toward feed or water or shade, and a man who had run a cow-calf operation for 31 years learned to read the loose grammar of how they moved. This was a sentence ended on one word. He set the bucket down on the concrete without looking at it, because he did not want to take his eyes off the gate at the far end of the pasture, the steel tube gate he had hung himself 11 years back, and at that distance, in that light, he could not yet say what stood beside it. He only knew the cattle had decided, and that their decision was older than anything he could teach them. He was a careful man. He knew it about himself the way he knew the play in his truck steering, or the give in the third board of the porch. Wade Coulter did not exaggerate. He had given measurements to insurance adjusters, and to the brand inspector, and to a county surveyor, and every one of them had written his figures down without checking, because his figures held. He kept a tally book in his shirt pocket with a stub of carpenter pencil pushed through the spiral. And in that book were calving dates and rainfall and the weight of culled steers, and not one fabrication in any of it. So when he tells himself even now that the cattle stopped all at once and faced the gate, he is not reaching for drama. He is reporting. The herd faced the gate. The morning was still dark enough that the yard light threw his shadow long across the lot, and beyond his shadow the cattle stood like a field of stones. It was October, the second week, and the nights had gone cold enough that the troughs skinned over by morning and the breath of the cattle hung in the still air above them. Wade had been up since 4, the way he was up at 4 most of his life, and he had made coffee in the dented percolator and let the dog out and carried the mineral toward the loafing pen on a path his boots had worn into the ground over a decade. The dog was a heeler named Patch, 6 years old, sharp as a tack, and Patch had not come with him to the pen. That was the first thing, though Wade did not weigh it until later. The dog had gone 3 steps off the porch and stopped and would not be called. Wade had clicked his tongue, and the dog had not moved, and Wade had figured the dog smelled a coon or a possum in the windbreak and let it go. A man cannot stop for every mood a dog takes. He had a wife in the house, Renee, asleep, and a granddaughter asleep in the back bedroom, 8 months old. Her name was Cora, and she belonged to his daughter, who worked nights at the hospital in town and slept days. So the baby stayed with them 3 nights a week. Wade thought about Cora, roughly. Once an hour, the way you think about a coal you have banked, not as a worry, but as a warmth you keep account of. He thought about her now, standing in the barn door, only because the silence in the lot was the kind of silence that makes a man take inventory of what he has to lose. The yard was quiet. Too quiet. And he noticed the quiet before he noticed anything else. There were no coyotes. That was the wrong thing named plain. Every night of his life on this place, the coyotes had run the draw west of the house, and most mornings they were still at it when he came out. That high, broken yipping that carried across the cold ground. He had stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing a clock. A clock you notice when it stops. The draw was silent. The windbreak was silent. Even the cattle, 40 head of them, made no sound. No shift of hooves on the frozen mud. No low call from the cows to the late calves. 40 animals stood in total stillness and faced one direction, and the only sound in the whole gray world was Wade's own blood moving in his ears. He looked at the gate. The shape beside it was tall. He told himself it was the cedar post, the corner brace he had set in concrete. But the corner brace was 4 feet, and this was not 4 feet. But he told himself it was a man somebody's hand walked over from the county road to poach a deer in the dark. And that explanation lasted about as long as it took to form, 'cause a man does not stand that still. And a man is not that tall, and a man does not raise the hackles on 40 head of cattle that have seen men their whole lives. The shape did not move. Wade did not move. The cattle did not move. And in the held breath of that moment he understood that whatever it was had been watching the herd before. The herd ever told him about it, and that he had walked out into the middle of something already in progress. Then the yard light, which ran on a photocell and had run faithful for years, buzzed once and went dark not off. Down like something had leaned on the current. It came back in 3 seconds, weak and orange, and in those 3 seconds of full dark Wade heard the cattle move, all of them, a single surge of bodies away from the gate and toward the barn, toward him, and he stepped back through the door and put the wall between himself and the pasture before he had decided to. When the light steadied, he made himself look again. The gate stood empty. The corner brace was 4 feet of cedar where it had always been. Whatever had stood beside it was gone, and the cattle were packed against the near fence, with their sides heaving and their eyes rimmed white, and Patch was barking now from the porch, finally, in a voice Wade had never heard the dog use. He did not go to the gate that morning. He told himself it was because of the dark and the cattle, and both of those were true, but the deeper truth was the one he did not say out loud, which was that some part of him older than 31 years of ranching did not want to stand where that thing had stood. He fed the cattle from the near side. He counted them twice and came up 40 both times. He carried the empty bucket back to the barn, and his hand was steady on the wire handle. And he was proud of that later, that his hand had been steady, because steadiness was the thing he had, instead of an explanation. When the sun came up, he walked the fence. Dawn came slow and gray, and gave him nothing he wanted. The frost had burned off the south slope, but lay heavy still in the shadow of the windbreak, and Wade went straight to the gate, with his coffee gone cold in his hand and Patch at his heel, the dog tight against his leg in a way it never walked. The ground by the gate was soft from the troughs overflowing, churned to a black paste by the cattle over weeks, and a man could not read much in churned ground. 4 feet out from the gate, though, in the smooth, frost-stiff grass that the cattle did not reach, there was a track. He crouched over it for a long time. It was pressed deep, deeper than a cow, deeper than the bull, deep enough that the maker had carried real weight on it, and it was not a hoof. It was long, longer than his own boot, and at the wide end it spread into what he first wanted to call toes, and then could not call anything else. 4 of them splayed, and at the tip of each a deeper point where something hard had bitten the soil. There was a 5th mark, set back, and off to the side smaller, the way a thumb sits off a hand. Wade had tracked deer and elk and coyote and bear sign on a hunting lease in the mountains for 20 years, and he had a knee that ached over more cold tracks than he could count, and he crouched over this one and ran the dry math of every animal he knew, and not one of them fit. He laid his own hand flat in the frost beside it for scale, and his hand looked small. He went and got the tape measure from the truck. He did not tell himself a story while he walked. He measured the track at 11.5 inches heel to tip and 7 inches across the splay. He wrote both figures in the tally book under the carpenter pencil in his careful hand, and the writing of it steadied him the way the steady hand had steadied him, because a number was a thing you could hold. There was one track. He looked for the next and could not find it. He cast in a circle, the way you cast for a blood trail widening, and the frost gave him nothing. No stride, no second print, as though the thing had set one foot down in the soft grass by the gate and then stepped only on ground that would not hold a mark. He stood up and his knee popped, and the dog was watching the windbreak and would not look at him. That was the first morning. Wade did not call anyone that day. There was nothing to call about that he could say without sounding like a man who had lost the thread, and a lifetime of being believed had made him careful with his own credibility. He had watched men in town lose the thing he had, the thing where their word was taken without a second look, and he had seen how fast it went, and how it never came back. So he worked the day through instead, because work was the answer he had always had for things that would not sit still in his head. He hauled a round bale to the south pasture on the spike of the loader, the tractor coughing in the coal until the block warmed, and he set the bale in the feeder and cut the net wrap off. With the folding knife he kept clipped in his right pocket, and the cattle that should have crowded the feeder hung back at the fence and watched him do it. They had never hung back from feed in their lives. He fixed a float in the stock tank that had been hanging up and overflowing, lying on the frozen ground with his sleeve pushed up and his bare forearm in water, cold enough to ache the bone, and he worked the new float onto the rod by feel and dried his arm on his coat and did not look at the windbreak though he wanted to. He split a cord of wood. His back told him plainly not to split, and the maul came down clean, and the rounds fell open, and the rhythm of it was the closest thing to peace he found that day. The whole day the track sat in his tally book at 11.5 by 7, 2 figures in carpenter pencil he could put his thumb on through the cloth of his pocket. The whole day Patch stayed on the porch and would not go past the loafing pen. And when Wade came in at dusk, the dog met him at the door and pressed against his legs and would not be still. And Renee asked what had gotten into the dog, and Wade said he didn't know, which was the first true thing and the first lie both, because he did not know. And he had a notion he was not saying. That night, the cattle bunched. He saw it from the kitchen window after supper, the herd drawn up tight in the center of the lot away from every fence line. The way cattle bunch in a blizzard. Except there was no blizzard, just a clear, cold night with the stars hard overhead. Renee saw him looking. She was a practical woman who had buried 2 dogs and her own mother on this place and did not spook, and she dried her hands on the dish towel and came to stand at the glass beside him without being asked. "What are they doing?" she said. "Bunched up," he said. She watched them a while. The window was cold enough that their breath fogged it, and she wiped a clear patch with the heel of her hand. "They only do that in weather," she said. "There's no weather. I know it. You going out to them?" He thought about the gate at the far end of the dark lot, and he thought about the track in his pocket, and he said no, they'll settle. And she looked at him a beat longer than the answer needed, because 34 years of marriage had taught her the shape of the things he left out, and then she let it go and went back to the sink. And Wade stood at the window until the dishwater ran out, and the kitchen light made the glass a mirror that showed him only his own face and the bunched pale shapes of the cattle behind it. He did not tell her about the track. He told himself he was protecting her and knew while he told it that he was protecting the version of himself she trusted. The one whose word held. The one who did not stand at windows after dark watching his own herd the way prey watches a tree line. He slept poorly. Round 2 he came awake with no reason he could name, the way you wake when a sound stops. And he lay still and listened to the house. The furnace ticked. The baby did not stir. And under all of it, low, came a sound he felt in his chest before his ears. Found it a vibration that ran in the floor joists and the bed frame, a layered thing, a bass rumble with a faster chattering riding on top of it, like 2 throats working in one chest. It came from the direction of the pasture, and it was not a cow, and it was not the furnace, and it was not any engine. It rose and held and fell away, and the house went silent. And Wade lay on his back with his eyes open and his heart going hard and did not wake his wife. He got up before light again, and the cattle were 40 head and unharmed and standing bunched, and the gate was empty. And there was no new track in the frost where he looked. Well, he began that morning to do the thing he knew how to do, which was to gather evidence. He drove to the farm store in town and bought 2 trail cameras, the kind he used to watch his hunting lease, and he came home and set them on the corner posts of the loafing pen angled at the gate, and he checked the batteries twice. And he felt better for having done a competent thing against a thing he could not name. Competence was the floor he stood on. He had always been able to stand on it. The cameras gave him 3 nights of nothing. Deer at the field, edge a barn cat, the cattle drifting in the green night vision wash. And on the 4th night, they gave him a frame that was not nothing. The first camera caught the cattle at 2:51 in the morning, surging away from the gate the way they had that first dawn. The second camera, angled at the gate itself, caught at 2:51 a frame that was blown out white in the lower corner, overexposed, as though something with its own warmth had passed too close to the lens. And in the next frame, the gate was empty. And the frame after that, the camera had stopped. The timestamp on the 3rd file was 2:51, and then the card held nothing more from that camera until Wade pulled it and reset it the next day. The camera had not died. It had been switched off. The little weatherproof housing was latched as he had latched it, and the switch inside was thumbed to off. And a man does not reach a switch inside a latched housing without opening the latch. And the latch had not been opened, because Wade had run a hair of grass across it the way he ran a hair across things he wanted to know about. And the hair was unbroken. He sat in the truck with the camera in his lap and worked the rational ladder 1 rung at a time, the way he had worked it his whole life. A short in the switch. He tested the switch, and it held. A low battery, browning out the board, the battery read full, a glitch in a cheap camera, then the same glitch in the same minute on the other camera that read 2:51 and went white. He climbed the ladder rung by rung, and at the top of it there was no roof, only open air, and he sat in the cold truck and felt the floor of competence he had always stood on tilt a few degrees under him. He called the sheriff's office that afternoon, not because he thought they would come, but because a careful man creates a record. He told the dispatcher there was a large predator harassing his herd, that he had tracks, that he had lost 2 cameras to it, and he kept his voice flat and his words plain, because he knew how these calls were heard. The dispatcher was kind and bored. She took his name and his road and said she would have a deputy swing by when one was free. And she asked if the animal had injured any livestock. And Wade said no. And he heard the call drop a notch in priority. In the small pause, he had given the figures the way he gave figures, 11.5 inches, 7 across, 2 cameras, and on the other end he could hear a keyboard. And he understood that the numbers that held with adjusters and brand inspectors did not hold here, because here the thing the numbers described had no box to be written into. A deputy did come, 2 days on, a young man. Clean-shaven, his breath showing as he stood at the gate in the flat afternoon light, and looked at the 11.5-inch track, now half melted and pocked by rain. He crouched over it the way young men crouch over things. Quick, already half decided. "Big dog," he said. "Maybe a bear come up out of the river breaks. They range when the mast crops thin." He stood and wrote a few lines on a pad and asked, had it killed anything? And Wade said no, and the deputy nodded as though that settled the size of it. "Call us if it takes a calf," he said. "We can get a depredation tag from the state on a confirmed kill." He was not unkind. He was just a man with a radio and a county to cover, and the thing at the gate was not in any manual he carried, and Wade did not press him, because pressing was how a man's word got the second look it could not survive. Wade thanked him and walked him to the car and watched him drive out, and the gate stood between them the whole time. And Wade noticed that the deputy, who had crouched with his back to that gate to look at the track, stood up and turned and did not once put his back to it again the whole way to the car, and got in facing it, and backed the car around, rather than nose past it. The young man would not have been able to say why. Wade could have told him. He said nothing. The nights stacked, each one started higher than the last. The cattle would not stay in the loafing pen after dark now, no matter how he fed them there, and he found the mornings drawn up against the house-side fence as close to the yard light as they could press. 40 head crowded into a third of the lot, with the far 2/3 standing empty under the stars. He moved a calf that had gone weak from the cold into the barn, and the others lowed for it all night and would not settle. And he understood the herd had reorganized itself entirely around a fact it could not be talked out of, and he had begun to reorganize himself the same way. He carried a flashlight and the old lever rifle when he went out at night, and he hated that he carried them, because carrying them was an admission. On the 6th night the sound came to the house again, and it came closer. He woke at 2:50, 10 minutes before 3, and lay listening, and the layered rumble rose from the pasture and rolled across the lot, and this time it did not stay at the gate. It moved. He tracked it by ear, the way you track a truck on a far road, the sound sliding along the south fence line toward the windbreak, and then turning, coming up the windbreak, toward the house. And he was out of bed and into his boots with a rifle in his hand. He did not turn on a light. He stood in the dark mudroom with the door cracked and the cold pouring in, and he listened to the thing come up the windbreak, and the sound was so low in places that he felt it in his teeth, and then at the edge of the yard light it stopped. The sound stopped. The yard was silent. And Patch, who had been pressed shaking against the kitchen cabinets, began to growl at the back wall of the house, at the wall that backed the room where the baby slept. Wade went through the house, without a light, fast and quiet. 31 years of knowing every board under his feet, and he stood in the doorway of the back bedroom and looked at the window. The shade was up. He never left it up. Rennie swore later she had drawn it at dusk, the way she always did, and Wade believed her. Because Renee did not misremember and did not embellish, and the two of them stood in the dark hallway and looked at the raised shade and the black square of glass behind it, and did not say what they were both thinking. The baby slept on her back with her arms thrown up. 8 months old, breathing slow, a small printed lamb on the front of the sleeper rising and falling. Beyond the glass, the yard light burned weak and orange. Wade crossed the room low and stood to the side of the window the way he had stood to the side of windows in a war a long time ago, and he looked out at a sharp angle. The glass at the bottom corner on the outside was fogged in a patch the size of a dinner plate, the way glass fogs when something warm breathes on it from the cold side. The patch was already shrinking at the edges. Something had stood at the window. Something tall enough to fog the bottom of a window, set 4.5 feet off the ground, breathing on the cold side of the glass, while the child slept 18 inches away. He did not sleep the rest of that night, and he did not the next. He moved the crib to the interior room, with no exterior wall, the room that had been his daughter's and held a sewing machine now, and he sat in the hall outside it in a kitchen chair with the rifle across his knees and the dog at his feet. Renee did not argue. She had seen the fogged glass. She had stopped asking him to come back to bed. In the morning he found a single track in the soft dirt of the flower bed under the back bedroom window, 11.5 inches by 7, 4 splayed toes and the thumb set back the same as the gate, and only one, and then nothing, as though the thing set one foot down where it wanted him to find it and walked out on ground that would not take a print. He photographed it with his phone, and the photograph made it look small and ordinary, and he hated the phone for that, for shrinking the thing down to where a deputy could call it a big dog. The trail cameras were gone, both of them, so he bought a fourth and a fifth and set them high this time, up under the eave looking down out of reach, and he ran his hair of grass across the housings. For 2 nights they held. On the 3rd night the herd surged at 250 and both cameras under the eaves, recorded in the same minute a wash of overexposure low in the frame and then the bloom of 2 points of light, steady, set wide, higher off the ground than a coyote's eyes, or a deer's, or a man's, amber going to white in the night vision. Not bouncing or darting, but lifting and turning together with a slow certainty of something that knew exactly where the lens was and was looking back into it. The eyes filled the lower third of the frame for 1 second across both cameras. Then the frame went white. Then the cameras held nothing. The housings were latched in the morning, and the hairs of grass were unbroken, and the switches were thumbed to off both of them, 10 feet up under the eave, where Wade had needed a ladder to reach them. He called a man he trusted then, an old houndsman named Errol, who had run bear and lion with dogs out of the river country for 50 years, and had a nose for sign that Wade respected more than any badge. Errol came out with 2 of his own dogs in a box on his truck, and the dogs would not leave the box. They were lion dogs, dogs that lived to strike a track and run it screaming into the dark, and they crouched in the box with their tails clamped and would not come down, and Errol stood looking at them a long while and then walked the fence with Wade in silence. He crouched over the gate track, the one Wade had roofed with a feed pan against the rain, and he was quiet for a long time, and Wade had known Errol 40 years and had never seen him without an opinion. Errol stood up finally and looked at the windbreak and the gate and the high cameras under the eave, and he said, "I have cut sign on every animal that walks this country." And he did not finish the sentence. He looked at the gate. He said, "I don't know what that is, and I have never in my life had to say that, and I find I do not like saying it." Then he loaded his dogs that would not hunt, and he drove out. And at the road he stopped his truck and sat a moment, and then rolled down his window and said back to Wade across the yard, "You keep that baby off the outside walls." And he drove away, and Wade stood in his own yard and understood that the one man whose belief he had wanted had given it to him, and that the belief did not help because Errol did not know either, and not knowing was the whole of it. The nights ran on toward the dark of the moon. The cattle stopped eating well. Wade found them mornings standing bunched and gaunt and silent, and he knew that a herd that does not graze is a herd losing weight he could not afford to lose, and he knew too that this had stopped being about cattle some nights ago. It was at the gate when the cattle stopped moving, and it had walked the fence to the windbreak and up the windbreak to the house, and it had fogged the glass at the baby's window, and the progression of it was not random. It was a thing, learning a place. It came closer each night by a measured amount, the way a man paces off a field he means to buy, the way Wade himself had paced off this very ground before he signed for it 31 years back, heel to toe along the fence line, counting his strides against the plat. It switched off the eyes that watched it, and it left one track where it wanted the track found, and it had not yet done the thing it was pacing toward. Wade understood that the way he understood. Weather coming, by the pressure of it, by the ache in the knee that had read more cold ground than he could count. And he made his preparations the way he made them for weather, plainly, without telling himself stories. He did not sleep at all the night of the new moon. He sat in the hall outside the interior room, with the baby in it. And Renee awake in the kitchen with the lights off and the dog against his boot, and the dark came down total and starless. And the yard light burned its weak orange circle and held back almost nothing. The cattle were silent. The coyotes had not run the draw in 2 weeks. At 3:10, the dog rose off Wade's boot and faced the back of the house. And the hair stood in a ridge down its spine, and it did not growl, it only stared. And Wade rose with it and stood with the rifle and faced the same wall, and the sound began. It began under the floor, in the joists, a bass rumble he felt come up through the legs of the chair he had just left, and the chattering rode up over it, 2 throats in one chest, and it was not at the gate and not at the windbreak. It was against the house. It was on the other side of the wall, the back wall, the interior room, shared with no exterior, because Wade had moved the crib to the one room that had a room between it and the night, and the sound was at the outer wall of that buffer room, as close as the house would let it come. And Wade tracked it by the floor in his feet, and it stopped at the window of the empty buffer room, the sewing room window, the one square of glass